An icy wind pierces the dark streets of Greenland, making her shiver. 12-year-old Aaliyah walks home, clenching her skinny hands into fists, hoping the movement will warm her a little. Her stomach is empty, her soul is tired. Her tattered sweatshirt doesn't save her from the cold, but the girl is used to enduring it. Something makes her slow down. An old man sits on a bench under a street lamp. He is shivering, wrapped in a thin coat, his eyes wandering around the deserted street. He looks as if he doesn't realize where he is. Aaliyah knows she should just walk on by. She has no food, no warm home, but something in her heart turns over. She takes a step toward him, and that step will change her life forever. The wind howled through the empty streets of Nuuk, biting through Aaliyah's thin sweatshirt like a blade. Her fingers were numb, her stomach hollow, but she kept walking, counting her steps to distract herself from the cold. Home wasn't far, just a tiny one-room apartment she shared with her grandmother. There was no heat, barely any food, but at least it was shelter. She just had to make it there. Then she saw him. An old man, sitting alone on a park bench under the flickering streetlight. His frail hands trembled as he hugged himself, his face pale and lost. He wore a thin coat, no hat, no gloves. He didn't belong here. Aaliyah hesitated. She should keep walking. People ignored her suffering every day, it was just how the world worked. She had nothing to give. And yet, she stepped forward. "Sir?" Her voice was soft, uncertain. The man's eyes lifted to hers, pale blue, filled with confusion. He blinked as if waking from a dream. I don't know where I am," he murmured. Aaliyah's heart clenched. She had a choice to make. And in that moment, she made the one that would change everything. Aaliyah took a deep breath. The sensible thing would be to walk away. She had barely enough food for herself and her grandmother. Taking in a stranger, especially an old man who didn't even know where he was reckless. But she knew what it felt like to be ignored. "Come with me," she said, holding out a hand. The old man hesitated, staring at her as if unsure she was real. Then, slowly, he reached out and took her hand. His fingers were ice cold, shaking against hers. They walked in silence through the snow-covered streets. The apartment was only a few blocks away, but each step felt heavier as doubt crept into Aaliyah's mind. What was she doing? What if he was dangerous? But when she glanced at him, all she saw was exhaustion. By the time they reached the apartment building, her hands were completely numb. She pushed open the door, leading him inside. The warmth, if it could even be called that, was a slight relief from the bitter cold outside. Her grandmother, a frail woman with deep wrinkles and tired eyes, sat in the corner, wrapped in layers of blankets. When she saw the old man, her expression tightened. "Aaliyah," she said, her voice low. "Who is this?" "He was alone," Aaliyah said simply. Her grandmother sighed, shaking her head. "We don't have enough for ourselves." "I know." Aaliyah hesitated. "But we have something. And he has nothing." For a long moment, there was only silence. Then, with another sigh, her grandmother reached for the small pot on the stove. "Sit down," she said to the man. "You can share what we have." The old man lowered himself onto the creaky chair, looking around as if he couldn't believe where he was. "What's your name?" Aaliyah asked. He hesitated, his brow furrowing. I don't remember." A chill ran down her spine, not from the cold, but from something deeper. Who was this man? And why did he seem so lost? The wind howled through the narrow streets, cutting through Aaliyah's sweatshirt as if it were nothing more than paper. She hugged herself tighter, her breath curling in front of her in ghostly wisps. She was used to this kind of cold, the kind that seeped into your bones, the kind that made hunger even harder to ignore. Her feet ached with each step, but home wasn't far now. Just a few more blocks, and she'd be inside. Inside wasn't warm, but at least it was out of the wind. But then she saw him. The old man was still sitting on the frozen bench beneath the flickering streetlight, his arms wrapped around himself as he shivered violently. His head drooped forward slightly, his breath unsteady. He wasn't moving much. Aaliyah hesitated mid-step. Maybe he's asleep, she thought. Maybe he's just waiting for someone. But deep down, she knew the truth. People like him, people like her, didn't get waited on. She could keep walking. Pretend she didn't see him. It wasn't her problem. But then another gust of wind blasted through the street, making her flinch. He didn't even react. That wasn't normal. Something twisted in her stomach. She turned back. Her footsteps were slow at first, cautious. The last thing she needed was trouble. Nuke wasn't a place where you blindly trusted people, especially at night. But as she got closer, she noticed more details. His hands, thin, trembling, with knuckles turning almost blue from the cold. His coat, worn, barely better than her own. His face, pale, lost, his eyes darting around like he was trying to place himself in the world. Aaliyah took a breath, then spoke. "Sir?" No response. She stepped closer, her heart pounding a little harder. "Hey." She tried again, this time louder. "Are you okay?" The man's head jerked up, and for a brief moment, pure confusion filled his pale blue eyes. He blinked rapidly, as if trying to make sense of her. His voice was hoarse, barely audible. "I don't know where I am." Aaliyah's stomach clenched. He really wasn't okay. She glanced around the empty street. No one else was stopping. No one else cared. She should leave. Her grandmother's warning echoed in her head. "We can barely take care of ourselves, Aaliyah. We don't have room for kindness." But wasn't that exactly why she should help? She knew what it was like to feel invisible. She knew what it was like to wonder if anyone in the world would notice if you just disappeared. And right now, this man, this complete stranger, looked like he was moments away from fading into nothing. She clenched her fists. If I walk away, who else will help him? The answer was simple. No one. She made her choice. "Come with me," she said, her voice firmer now. The old man hesitated, as if he couldn't quite believe what she was saying. His body trembled harder, his teeth chattering too much for him to form words. Aaliyah extended her hand. For a second, nothing happened. Then, slowly, his cold, frail fingers wrapped around hers. The streets of Nuke were nearly deserted, only the occasional flickering light casting long shadows along the frozen sidewalks. Aaliyah led him forward, their footsteps crunching against the ice-covered pavement. Each step felt heavier. Her mind raced. What am I doing? Her grandmother wasn't going to be happy. They barely had food. They barely had anything. But when she glanced at the man beside her, shuffling forward like his body barely remembered how to move, she knew she couldn't turn back now. Still, doubt nagged at her. "Do you really not remember anything?" she asked as they walked. He was silent for a moment. Then, slowly, he shook his head. "No. I just remember the cold." His voice was raw, like he had been screaming before she found him. "I remember waking up on that bench." But before that, his brow furrowed. "It's all gone." Aaliyah's breath hitched. Gone? She had seen people lost before, drunk, confused, out of their minds from hunger. But this was different. It wasn't just that he didn't know where he was. It was like he didn't know who he was. They reached her building. The small, worn-down complex wasn't much, peeling paint, broken stairs, but it was home. Aaliyah pushed open the front door, leading him inside. The air was slightly warmer, though still filled with that stale scent of damp wood and dust. Her grandmother was sitting in her usual spot near the window, wrapped in blankets. Her sharp eyes flicked up as soon as Aaliyah stepped inside. They immediately landed on the stranger. Her lips pressed into a thin line. "Aaliyah." Her voice was calm, but there was no mistaking the warning behind it. "Who is this?" Aaliyah swallowed hard. He was outside. He doesn't remember who he is. Her grandmother's expression darkened. We don't have room for strays. Aaliyah stiffened. He's not a stray. The old man, still shivering, hesitated at the doorway, looking uncertain. I can leave if it's too much trouble. Aaliyah's grandmother sighed. Sit, she said, motioning to the small wooden chair near the stove. Aaliyah exhaled in relief as the old man slowly lowered himself onto the chair, his body sagging with exhaustion. Her grandmother didn't say anything as she grabbed the small pot from the stove and poured some of the leftover soup into a bowl. She placed it in front of him. It's not much, she said. But it's warm. The old man blinked down at the bowl. For a moment, Aaliyah thought he might cry. Then, carefully, he picked up the spoon with shaking fingers and took a sip. His entire body relaxed, just slightly. Aaliyah sat across from him, watching carefully. Do you remember anything? A family? A home? The spoon hovered over the bowl. His brow furrowed deeply. I think, his voice was distant, like he was pulling at a thread just beyond his reach. Then his entire body tensed. There was someone, he murmured. A boy. No, a man. His fingers tapped against the table, frustration flickering in his eyes. He was strong. Determined. His breathing hitched slightly. I can't see his face, but he meant something to me. Aaliyah exchanged a glance with her grandmother. Maybe we can help you remember, she said. The old man looked at her, something like hope flickering in his tired eyes. Then, knock, knock, knock. Aaliyah's heart skipped a beat. No one ever visited them. Her grandmother's expression tightened as she slowly got up, moving toward the door. Aaliyah swallowed hard. Something in her gut whispered, be careful. Her grandmother cracked the door open. And a man stood on the other side. Tall. Broad. Eyes sharp as ice. Aaliyah's breath caught. The man's gaze flickered past her grandmother, landing directly on the old man. For a moment, he just stared. Then his lips parted. Dad? The old man's spoon slipped from his fingers, clattering into the bowl. Everything had just changed. The word hung in the air like a ghost. Dad. The old man's spoon slipped from his fingers, clattering into the bowl. The faint sound of liquid splashing against the rim barely registered in the thick silence that followed. Aaliyah's breath caught in her throat. She turned her gaze toward the man standing in the doorway. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a heavy coat dusted with snow. His sharp, calculating eyes locked onto the old man as if searching for something beneath the wrinkles and confusion. The name rang in Aaliyah's ears, but it took her a second to connect it to the face in front of her. Then it hit her like a punch to the stomach. Jason. Jason Statham. She had seen him in movies, those old, scratchy DVDs passed around from house to house. He was always the hero, always unshakable, always a force of nature. But right now, standing in the doorway of her tiny, broken-down apartment, he looked vulnerable. His jaw was tight, but not with anger. It was something else. Something raw. The old man's fingers twitched. His gaze flickered between Aaliyah, her grandmother, and Jason. His breath was uneven. Finally, he spoke. I don't know you. The words fell like stones. Jason didn't move at first. His expression didn't even flicker. But his eyes, they said everything. Aaliyah could see it. The brief, almost invisible crack in the armor. But then he inhaled sharply, forcing his emotions back into a tight, controlled mask. He stepped inside. The room seemed to shrink, the silence stretching unbearably long. Aaliyah's eyes darted between the old man and the stranger in the doorway. Dad, the man repeated, stepping inside. Snow clung to his boots, melting into puddles on the worn floor. His gaze was sharp, scanning the old man's face with something between hope and fear. The old man blinked, his lips parting slightly. His fingers curled against the edge of the table as if grounding himself. I don't know you. A shadow crossed the stranger's face, but he quickly masked it. He turned to Aaliyah's grandmother. How long has he been here? She tightened her shawl around her shoulders. Aaliyah found him outside. He didn't know who he was, and he had nowhere to go. The man exhaled, rubbing his jaw. Then, as if remembering himself, he turned back to the old man and softened his tone. It's me. Jason. Aaliyah's breath caught in her throat. Jason? The name sounded familiar, too familiar. Jason Statham. The actor. Her wide eyes snapped back to the man in front of her. Now that she was really looking, the sharp jawline, the intense gaze, the undeniable presence, everything clicked. It was him. She had seen his movies on old second-hand DVDs, grainy and scratched but still thrilling to watch. And now he was standing in her tiny apartment, looking like he had just stepped out of the screen. The old man studied him, his brow furrowing. Jason, he murmured, rolling the name on his tongue. His fingers twitched, as if something was trying to break through the fog in his mind. Then he shook his head. I'm sorry. I don't remember. Jason's jaw tightened. For a brief moment, he looked like he had been punched in the gut. But he quickly steadied himself, shoving his hands into his coat pockets. I've been looking for you, he said. His voice was calmer now, but there was an undercurrent of urgency. You've been missing for weeks. Aaliyah frowned. Missing? That meant someone had been looking for him all this time. Do you know what happened to me? The old man asked. Jason hesitated. Not exactly. You disappeared. I've been searching everywhere. He exhaled sharply. And now I find you here, with strangers? His gaze flicked toward Aaliyah, unreadable. She lifted her chin slightly. He wasn't with anyone before. He was alone. Jason studied her for a moment, as if trying to understand why a girl like her would take in a man like his father. Then he nodded. You helped him. It wasn't a question, but there was something behind his words, something close to gratitude. Aaliyah's grandmother spoke up. He can stay here until he's ready to leave. Jason hesitated, glancing at his father, who still looked confused and lost. Then he sighed. I need to make a few calls. He pulled out his phone, stepping away toward the hallway. The old man looked at Aaliyah, uncertainty flickering in his pale blue eyes. Should I go with him? She bit her lip, thinking. This was his family. His son. But why did she feel like something wasn't right? The room felt frozen in time. Jason stood just inside the doorway, his broad frame casting a long shadow over the small apartment. His breath was steady, controlled, but his eyes burned with something raw. The old man sat stiffly at the table, his hands gripping the edges as if the world was tilting beneath him. His pale blue eyes flickered with uncertainty, scanning Jason's face, searching for something familiar. But there was nothing. I don't know you, he whispered again. Jason's jaw clenched. You do, he said. You just don't remember. The old man flinched slightly at the insistence in Jason's voice. His fingers tapped nervously against the table, a small, repetitive motion. Aaliyah noticed. She had seen people react like this before. When memories weren't gone but buried, hidden beneath layers of time and trauma. She took a careful step closer. What do you feel? She asked softly. The old man's hands stilled. He glanced at her, then back at Jason. I don't know. Jason exhaled sharply, his patience clearly fraying. Dad, please, he said. His voice was quieter now, less controlled. Almost pleading. I've been looking everywhere for you. This isn't some mistake. You are my father. The old man inhaled deeply, his chest rising and falling in a slow, measured rhythm. Then, after a long pause, I believe you, he said. Jason's shoulders tensed. But The old man continued, "Believing you doesn't mean I remember." The words hung between them, heavy and unmovable. Jason's hands curled into fists in his coat pockets. His control was slipping, but he forced himself to stay calm. He turned to Aaliyah. "How long has he been here?" Aaliyah's grandmother, who had been silently watching, finally spoke. "A few hours," she said. "My granddaughter found him freezing to death on a bench." Jason's eyes flicked to Aaliyah. Something shifted in his gaze, something close to gratitude. But it was gone in an instant. He turned back to his father. "Do you remember anything? Where you were before this?" The old man shook his head slowly. "I remember, cold. And pain." His hands trembled slightly. "And I remember, running." Aaliyah stiffened. Jason's expression darkened. "Running from what?" The old man's breath quickened. I can't see it." He closed his eyes, frustration etched into every wrinkle on his face. "It's like trying to grab smoke." Aaliyah stepped closer. "Try to focus on a detail. Anything." Jason remained silent, his gaze locked on his father. The old man's lips parted. "A name." Jason leaned forward slightly. "What name?" His father's brow furrowed, his eyes darting back and forth as if searching for something invisible. His breath hitched. "Rains?" Jason's entire body stiffened. Aaliyah caught the reaction instantly. Jason knew that name. Before she could say anything, Jason stepped toward the old man. "Dad," he said, his voice lower now, almost urgent. "Listen to me. What else do you remember? Do you know who Rains is?" The old man's eyes flickered with something. Fear? Recognition? He shook his head quickly, as if trying to block something out. "I don't know." Jason cursed under his breath. Aaliyah narrowed her eyes. "You do know who that is," she said, looking straight at Jason. Jason's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. Silence. Then, knock. 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 Everyone froze. Aaliyah's grandmother slowly turned toward the door. Jason's entire stance changed. He shifted slightly, positioning himself between his father and the entrance. His hand twitched at his side. Aaliyah felt the hair on her arms stand up. "Who else knows he's here?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jason didn't answer. Another knock. Louder this time. A deep voice spoke through the wood. "We know he's in there." Aaliyah's stomach dropped. The apartment suddenly felt too small, too exposed. Jason's hand clenched at his side. Aaliyah could see it now, the tension in his muscles, the way his eyes flicked toward the door like he was calculating something. He was preparing for something. Something bad. The old man swallowed hard. "Who are they?" he whispered. Jason turned to him, his expression unreadable. "You tell me," he said. The old man's breathing grew unsteady again. His fingers curled against the wooden chair, and for the first time, a real flicker of panic crossed his face. Aaliyah's grandmother took a step toward the door. Jason moved instantly. "Don't." Her eyes narrowed. "You're not in charge here." Jason didn't back down. "If you open that door, you won't like what happens next." Aaliyah's breath hitched. Her grandmother hesitated. The deep voice spoke again, this time sharper. "We won't ask again." Jason cursed under his breath. He turned back to the old man. "We have to go. Now." The old man's gaze flickered to Aaliyah. She swallowed hard. "They're not just here to talk, are they?" Jason met her eyes. His expression was all the confirmation she needed. "No. They weren't here to talk." Time snapped back into motion. Jason moved fast, grabbing his father's arm and pulling him toward the back of the apartment. "Is there another way out?" Aaliyah's grandmother, now fully alert, pointed toward the small back window. The alley. Jason nodded, already moving. Aaliyah didn't even think. She grabbed their emergency bag from under the bed and slung it over her shoulder. They didn't have much, but whatever was in here, they might need. Another loud bang against the door. The frame rattled. "They're coming in," Jason muttered. The old man hesitated, eyes darting toward the front door like some part of him was desperate to remember why these people were after him. Jason grabbed his shoulder. "Dad, move." That word, Dad, seemed to snap him out of it. The old man nodded. Aaliyah climbed out first, her feet hitting the snow-covered alleyway. The cold air bit her skin, but she didn't care. Jason helped his father out next, moving fast. The moment they were all outside, Jason turned to Aaliyah's grandmother. "Can you keep up?" She shot him a glare. "Don't patronize me." Jason actually looked impressed for half a second. Then, a crash. The front door had been breached. Shadows moved inside the apartment. Aaliyah's heart pounded. "They're in." Jason's grip tightened on his father's arm. "Run." They sprinted into the night. Behind them, voices shouted. Aaliyah didn't look back. But in the pit of her stomach, she knew. This wasn't over. This was just the beginning. Aaliyah's stomach twisted. Something about this felt off. Jason Statham, a world-famous actor, had just appeared at her doorstep, claiming this lost, fragile old man was his father. It should have made sense. But why did it feel wrong? The old man, Jason's father, lowered his gaze to his half-empty bowl of soup. He still looked uncertain, lost in a fog of confusion. Jason, now pacing near the door, spoke into his phone in a low voice. Aaliyah couldn't make out the words, but his tone was sharp, urgent. She turned back to the old man. "Do you feel like you know him?" she asked quietly. His forehead creased as he thought. I don't know. It's like trying to hold onto a dream when you wake up. It slips away the harder you try." His fingers tapped against the table again. "But he said I was missing?" Aaliyah nodded. "For weeks." The old man exhaled. "Then why don't I remember where I've been?" A shiver ran down her spine. That was the question that had been gnawing at her too. If Jason was telling the truth, if this man had gone missing for weeks, where had he been before ending up on that bench? And why did no one find him until now? Jason finished his call and turned back toward them. His face was unreadable. "A car will be here soon," he said. "We'll get him checked by a doctor." The old man looked at him, then at Aaliyah. He still seemed hesitant, as if waiting for something to feel right. Aaliyah bit her lip. What if he stays a little longer? Jason's sharp eyes landed on her. "You think that's a good idea?" She straightened her back. "He's comfortable here. Rushing him might make things worse." Jason studied her for a long moment, then sighed. "Look, kid. I get that you're trying to help. And I appreciate it. But my father—" "What if I'm not your father?" the old man interrupted. Jason's jaw tightened. "What?" The old man hesitated, rubbing his temple. "I don't feel like I belong to your world. I don't recognize my own son." He exhaled sharply. "What if you're wrong?" Jason went completely still. For the first time since he arrived, Aaliyah saw something flicker across his face, something that looked a lot like fear. Then he forced a tight smile. "Let's not do this now." The sound of tires crunching against the snow outside made Aaliyah's pulse quicken. The car had arrived. Jason extended a hand. "Come on, Dad. Let's go home." The old man didn't move. His eyes flicked toward Aaliyah. She didn't know why, but suddenly, she felt the weight of his unspoken question. "Should I go?" She had no idea what the right answer was. But something deep in her gut whispered, "Be careful." The cold night air hit Aaliyah like a slap, but she barely felt it. They ran. Snow crunched beneath their feet, their breath came in sharp bursts of steam, and the narrow alley stretched out before them like a frozen corridor of escape. Behind them, shouts. Heavy boots slamming against the ground. They were being chased. Aaliyah's heart pounded as she sprinted alongside Jason and his father. Her grandmother moved with surprising speed for someone her age, her steps sure and steady. Jason glanced over his shoulder, his sharp eyes scanning the darkness. They're gaining. His father, still struggling to keep up, gasped, "Who are they?" Jason didn't answer. Instead, he grabbed Aaliyah's wrist and pulled her forward, urging her to move faster. The alley split into two paths ahead, left or right. Jason didn't hesitate. Left! They skidded around the corner, nearly slipping on the ice. The alley was tighter here, lined with rusting dumpsters and piles of frozen trash bags. The buildings loomed above them, their windows dark. No one to help. No one to witness. Aaliyah's gut twisted. Jason let go of her wrist and turned suddenly, pressing his back against the brick wall. He motioned for everyone to stop. They froze. The sounds of pursuit grew louder. Boots crunching. Low voices. The men were close. Aaliyah's lungs burned from the cold air, but she forced herself to stay still. Her fingers curled into fists, her pulse drumming against her skin. A shadow moved at the mouth of the alley. A man in a heavy coat stepped into view. He held something in his hand. Aaliyah's breath caught. A gun. Jason reacted instantly. In one fluid motion, he reached into his coat, faster than Aaliyah could register, and pulled out something small and metallic. A flick of his wrist. A knife. The man with the gun barely had time to register what was happening before Jason moved. Fast. 1 second, Jason was against the wall. The next, he lunged. The knife slashed in a precise arc, slicing across the man's wrist. The gun clattered to the ground. The man cursed, stumbling back, but Jason wasn't done. He moved like a predator, grabbing the man by his collar, twisting him around, and slamming him into the brick wall. The man grunted in pain, his breath escaping in a sharp exhale. Aaliyah barely had time to process it. Jason grabbed the man's wrist, twisted, another sharp grunt of pain, and snapped something out of his coat pocket. A phone! Jason's fingers moved fast, yanking a small tracker chip from the device before dropping it on the ground and crushing it beneath his boot. Then, without a word, he turned and grabbed his father's arm. Move! No hesitation. No wasted time. Aaliyah followed, her pulse still racing. Jason had just taken down a fully grown man in seconds. And he hadn't even looked surprised to do it. They ran again, turning down another alley, weaving through the city's darkened backstreets. The sound of their pursuers faded behind them. For now. After what felt like forever, Jason finally slowed, pulling them into a shadowed doorway of an abandoned shop. His breath was steady, controlled. Aaliyah, on the other hand, was panting. She leaned against the cold brick, her mind still spinning. Okay, she gasped. What was that? Jason wiped his knife on his coat and slipped it back into a hidden sheath. That, he said calmly, was me keeping us alive. The old man was still catching his breath. He looked up at Jason, his expression both odd and uneasy. Where did you? Jason cut him off. We don't have time for questions. Aaliyah narrowed her eyes. You knew they'd come, didn't you? Jason didn't answer. Her frustration bubbled over. Who are these people? Jason exhaled sharply. The kind you don't want to meet twice. That wasn't an answer. Aaliyah's grandmother, ever observant, spoke next. You recognized that name earlier. Rains. Jason's entire body went rigid. A beat of silence. Then he turned to his father. You said that name before. Do you remember why? The old man hesitated. He rubbed his temples, his expression clouded with frustration. I don't know. It was just there. Jason's jaw tightened. Think harder. The old man's fingers curled into his coat. I remember running. I remember danger. His breath hitched. And I remember a deal. Jason's entire demeanor shifted. His posture stiffened, his eyes darkened. A deal? The old man nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. I think I made a deal with Rains. Aaliyah's stomach twisted. Jason inhaled slowly, his fingers flexing at his sides. If that's true, he said quietly, then we're all in a lot more trouble than I thought. Aaliyah couldn't stay silent anymore. Who is Rains? She demanded. Jason met her gaze. For a moment, he seemed to consider lying. But then, surprisingly, he answered. Edward Rains, he said. Former government agent. A fixer. The kind of guy who makes problems disappear. Aaliyah's breath caught. Disappear how? Jason's eyes were ice. Permanently. A chill ran down her spine. The old man swallowed hard. And I knew him? Jason nodded slowly. More than that. He hesitated. If you were dealing with Rains, then you weren't just anyone. A heavy silence filled the space. The old man looked at his hands, as if trying to find the missing pieces of himself. Aaliyah's grandmother, ever calm, finally spoke. So what happens now? Jason ran a hand over his face. Now. He exhaled. We disappear. Aaliyah frowned. Disappear where? Jason's eyes flicked toward the street. His jaw was tight. Somewhere they can't find us. The old man suddenly spoke, his voice distant. There's a cabin. Jason's head snapped toward him. What? The old man's eyes were far away, like he was seeing something just beyond reach. A cabin. In the mountains. I don't know where, but I think I used it before. His expression darkened. And I think Rains doesn't know about it. Jason's expression flickered. That's something. Aaliyah's heart pounded. So we run? Jason met her eyes. No, he said. We fight smart. The old man exhaled, his fingers twitching. And what if I remember something I don't want to? Jason's voice was steady. Then we deal with it. Another silence. Then Jason straightened. Let's go. And just like that, their path was set. There was no turning back. The room was thick with tension. Aaliyah could feel it pressing against her chest, making it harder to breathe. The old man, Jason's supposed father, kept his gaze locked on her as if she held the answer to a question neither of them understood. Outside, the car's engine hummed softly, waiting. Jason's patience was thinning. Dad, Jason said again, his voice firmer now. We need to go. The old man's fingers twitched on the edge of the table. What if I don't want to? Jason's jaw clenched. It's not about what you want. You need help. I have doctors, a safe place, people who can figure out what happened to you. Aaliyah's grandmother, who had been quiet this whole time, finally spoke. If he doesn't remember, should he really be forced to go somewhere unfamiliar? Jason turned toward her. His expression was unreadable, but Aaliyah could see the muscle in his jaw tighten. With all due respect, ma'am, you don't know him. You don't understand the situation. Aaliyah's grandmother didn't flinch. Neither does he. The old man inhaled sharply, looking at his trembling hands. I want to trust you, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. But I don't remember you. And something about this feels wrong. Jason's face darkened. Wrong? His voice was quieter now, but somehow more dangerous. You think this, he gestured around the tiny apartment, is better than coming home with me? Aaliyah felt her own hands curl into fists. It's not about better. It's about what he wants. Jason's sharp gaze snapped to her. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, he sighed, ran a hand over his face. When he spoke again, his voice was calmer, but there was something else underneath it. Frustration? Sadness? Fine. Jason took a step back. If you don't want to come with me right now, I won't force you. Aaliyah released a breath she didn't even realize she had been holding. Jason turned toward her. But this isn't over. She met his gaze, unblinking. I didn't think it was. Jason studied her for a moment, then reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small card. He placed it on the table. My number. If he changes his mind, or if you do, call me. The old man didn't move. Jason exhaled sharply, then turned toward the door. I'll be back, he said. And with that, he left. The silence he left behind was suffocating. The old man stared at the card on the table, his face unreadable. Aaliyah finally found her voice. What do we do now? The old man looked up at her, his pale blue eyes troubled. I don't know, he admitted. But something tells me we don't have much time to figure it out. Outside, Jason's card disappeared into the snowy night. And deep in Aaliyah's gut, she knew this wasn't the last time she'd see him. Not even close. The frozen streets of Nuke stretched out before them, eerily silent. Aaliyah's breath curled in the frigid air as she followed Jason's quick, measured steps. He moved with the kind of confidence that made her think he had done this before, escaping, evading, planning. And she had no doubt now. Jason Statham wasn't just an actor. He was something else. Beside her, the old man, his supposed father, kept looking over his shoulder, his hands shaking inside his coat pockets. His mind was still a maze of broken memories, but the fear in his eyes? That was real. Jason led them through a series of side streets, moving deliberately, avoiding main roads, keeping their profiles low. We need a car, he muttered under his breath. Aaliyah glanced around at the near-empty streets. And where exactly do you plan on getting one? Jason's sharp eyes flicked toward her. We'll figure it out. The problem was, they were running out of time. Somewhere behind them, the men who had broken into their apartment were still searching. They weren't safe yet. Aaliyah's grandmother, surprisingly calm for someone being chased by dangerous men, kept pace with them easily. We can't just run forever, she said. Jason didn't look back. We won't have to. But even he didn't sound convinced. They turned a corner and stumbled upon a dimly lit side street lined with parked cars. Most of them were covered in a thin layer of frost, untouched for hours. Jason scanned them quickly. Aaliyah folded her arms. You're not planning on stealing one, are you? Jason gave her a look. You got a better idea? Aaliyah opened her mouth, then closed it. Her grandmother, however, didn't seem nearly as fazed. If it gets us out of here, do what you have to. Jason smirked slightly. I like her. The old man, still lost in thought, barely reacted. Jason moved to the nearest car and tried the door handle. Locked. Of course. But just as Jason was about to pull out a small tool from his coat pocket, a voice rang out from the shadows. You looking for a ride? Everyone froze. Aaliyah's pulse spiked. A man stepped out from the alleyway, his breath curling in the cold. He was tall, wrapped in a heavy coat, a thick beanie pulled low over his head. His face was half hidden in the dim light, but his tone was unmistakably amused. Jason's entire posture shifted, instantly guarded. Who's asking? The man chuckled. Someone who doesn't like the people chasing you. Aaliyah exchanged a quick look with Jason. This felt wrong. Too convenient. Jason took a slow step forward. And why would that be? The man's smirk didn't fade. Because I know who they work for. His eyes flicked to the old man. And I know why they want him. The old man stiffened. Jason's voice remained steady. Who are you? The stranger shrugged. A friend. Aaliyah had seen enough movies to know one thing. Friends didn't show up like this. Jason's jaw tightened. We're not getting in a car with a stranger. The man raised his hands. Fair enough. He nodded toward the street. But you don't have many options. Those guys? They're not far behind. Aaliyah hated that he was right. Her grandmother studied the man carefully. And what exactly do you get out of this? The man's smirk faded slightly. Maybe I don't like people disappearing. Jason didn't blink. You work for Rains, didn't you? The air in the alley thickened. The man let out a slow breath. A long time ago. Aaliyah's gut twisted. And now? The man met her gaze. Now, I'd rather be on the other side. Jason studied him, weighing every word. He was good at reading people, that much was clear. And right now, he was deciding whether to trust this guy or leave him in the cold. Finally, Jason exhaled. Fine. Aaliyah's stomach flipped. We're actually doing this? The man turned, motioning toward a black SUV parked just down the road. Get in. Aaliyah hesitated, but Jason gave her a look that clearly said we don't have time to argue. She swallowed hard and followed. The doors unlocked with a soft click. They climbed inside. The moment the doors shut, the man started the engine. The car rumbled to life, headlights slicing through the darkness. As they pulled away, Aaliyah caught one last glimpse of the street behind them. And saw two figures stepping into view. The men from the apartment. Too late. They had escaped. For now. The inside of the SUV was warm, but the tension was ice cold. Jason sat in the front seat, his body still rigid with alertness. Aaliyah and her grandmother sat in the back, flanking the old man, who was staring blankly out the window. The stranger drove in silence for a long moment before speaking. You want answers, he said finally. Jason's eyes flicked toward him. That depends. You planning on actually giving them? The man exhaled. I'll tell you what I know. But you're not going to like it. Aaliyah's fingers curled against the seat. The man continued. Your father, he said, nodding toward the old man, was involved in something big. And I don't just mean government work. I mean off-the-books kind of stuff. Deals that don't exist on paper. Jason's grip tightened on his knee. What kind of deals? The man's gaze remained on the road. The kind you don't walk away from. Aaliyah's stomach twisted. Jason exhaled. Then how did he? The man's jaw tensed. I don't know. But whatever happened, whatever he did, Rains wants him back. Aaliyah turned to the old man. Do you remember any of this? His fingers trembled slightly. I remember running. The stranger nodded. That's because you weren't supposed to survive. Silence. Heavy. Suffocating. Aaliyah's heart pounded. Her grandmother finally spoke. Where are we going? The man didn't hesitate. Somewhere safe. Somewhere Rains can't reach you. Jason didn't relax. Not even a little. And we're just supposed to trust you? The man finally glanced at him. You don't have to trust me. His eyes flickered in the rearview mirror toward the old man. But if he doesn't remember the right things in time, none of us are making it out of this alive. Aaliyah's breath hitched. The road stretched ahead of them, dark and endless. And for the first time, she realized. This wasn't just about an old man with lost memories. This was bigger. Much, much bigger. The night stretched on, but sleep never came. Aaliyah lay on her thin mattress, staring at the cracked ceiling, Jason's words looping in her head. This isn't over. She rolled onto her side, stealing a glance at the old man. He was asleep in the chair, a blanket draped over his shoulders. His face, even in rest, looked troubled. Something wasn't right. Jason had come too fast. If his father had truly been missing for weeks, how had he suddenly known to show up at her door? Aaliyah sat up, rubbing the exhaustion from her eyes. She needed answers. Carefully, she reached for the card Jason had left. His number stared back at her in bold black print. Her fingers hovered over it. She could call. She could ask him what he wasn't saying. But before she could decide, a rustling sound made her freeze. The old man stirred, his face twitching like he was lost in a nightmare. His fingers clenched the blanket. "No," he mumbled. His breathing turned ragged. "No, no, no, Jason, run." Aaliyah shot forward. "Hey, wake up!" His eyes snapped open. Wild. Terrified. He gasped for air, his chest rising and falling in sharp bursts. "Are you okay?" she asked. His gaze darted around the room, confused, then landed on her. Slowly, his breathing steadied. He wiped his damp forehead, visibly shaken. He swallowed hard. "I remembered something." Aaliyah's heart kicked up. "What?" The old man shut his eyes for a moment, gripping his temples. There was danger. Jason was in trouble. He shook his head. "No. We were in trouble. Someone was after us." The air in the room turned cold in a way that had nothing to do with the broken heater. Aaliyah's grandmother, now awake, frowned. "Who was after you?" "I don't know," he admitted, frustration in his voice. "But I remember running. Hiding. And Jason, he was trying to protect me." His brows furrowed. "But something went wrong." His voice faltered. "I think I left." Aaliyah's stomach twisted. "Left?" The old man's fingers trembled against the blanket. "I think I abandoned him." The words felt heavy, like a confession. Aaliyah's grandmother's expression darkened. "If someone was after you, do you think Jason is still in danger?" Silence. Then, a heavy knock on the door. Aaliyah's blood ran cold. Her grandmother's eyes darted to her. Who would be here at this hour? The old man looked just as tense. "Something's wrong." Aaliyah swallowed hard and crept toward the door. Carefully, she pressed her ear against it. A pause. Then a deep voice, one that didn't belong to Jason, spoke through the wood. "We know he's in there." Aaliyah's pulse slammed in her throat. "Open the door," the voice demanded. "Now." Aaliyah's heart pounded so hard she thought they might hear it through the door. "We know he's in there." The voice was cold, steady. It wasn't Jason. And that terrified her more than anything. Her grandmother's hand touched her shoulder, firm but gentle. "Step back," she whispered. The old man gripped the arm of his chair, his breath coming faster. "They found me." His voice was barely above a whisper. Aaliyah swallowed. "Who are they?" His eyes darted to the door. "People who don't want me to remember." Another knock, this time harder. More impatient. Aaliyah's grandmother squared her shoulders. "We're not opening that door." The old man shook his head. "That won't stop them." Aaliyah's pulse spiked. "What do we do?" For a moment, no one spoke. Then, crack! The doorframe splintered. The handle jerked violently. They were trying to force their way in. Aaliyah jumped back. "They're breaking in!" The old man's entire body tensed. And then, something shifted in his expression. It was like a spark reigniting, some part of him that had been lost suddenly roaring back. He stood, stronger than before. "We have to go. Now." Aaliyah's grandmother hesitated for only a second before grabbing their emergency bag from under the bed. She always kept it ready. Just in case. The old man grabbed Aaliyah's wrist. His grip was firm but not harsh. "There's a back way, right? Aaliyah nodded. Through the alley. Bam! The door shuttered. They didn't have much time. Her grandmother pushed the window open, the cold night air rushing in. Hurry! Aaliyah scrambled out first, landing in the snow-covered alley behind the building. The old man followed, his movements faster, more controlled, like his instincts had taken over. Her grandmother was last. She turned just as the front door exploded inward. Dark figures rushed inside. Aaliyah barely caught a glimpse, tall men in heavy coats, moving with a purpose. "Geo!" the old man barked. They ran. The snow crunched under their feet as they bolted through the alley, weaving between dumpsters and fire escapes. Aaliyah's breath burned in her chest, her legs aching, but fear kept her moving. Behind them, shouts. Heavy footsteps. "They're following us," she gasped. The old man's grip on her wrist tightened, guiding her. He knew where to go. Even in his confusion, his body remembered something his mind had lost. A turn. A back street. A shortcut. They were almost there, almost free. Then, a black SUV skidded into view, blocking their path. Doors flew open. More men stepped out. They were surrounded. Aaliyah's breath hitched. This was it. Then a voice, calm, sharp, cut through the chaos. "Let them go." Aaliyah turned, heart pounding. Jason. He stood between them and the men, his expression stone cold. One of the men stepped forward. "You don't understand, Statham. He belongs to us." Jason's jaw tightened. "He's my father." The man chuckled darkly. "Then why did he run from you?" Silence. Aaliyah's gaze flicked to the old man. He was staring at Jason. But this time, something was different. Recognition. Memories clicking into place. His lips parted. Jason. Jason inhaled sharply, his hardened exterior cracking just for a second. The men shifted, impatient. "Enough of this," one of them growled, reaching for something inside his coat. Jason moved first. Faster than Aaliyah thought possible, he lunged, striking with precision. One man went down. Then another. Chaos erupted. The old man moved too, like muscle memory kicking in. He wasn't weak anymore. He fought, dodged, countered. He remembered. Aaliyah and her grandmother ducked as the fight exploded around them. In a blur of motion, Jason grabbed the old man's arm. "Dad, we have to go, now." This time, he didn't hesitate. They ran. Down the alley. Out of the trap. Into the night. And as they disappeared into the city, one thought burned in Aaliyah's mind. This wasn't over. It was just the beginning.